Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Cheating Tales Lab. We appreciate you joining us, and we can't wait to dive into another cheating wife story. So, without further ado, let's begin. Marcus Steele's pager went off like a firecracker, shattering the relative calm of the hospital corridor. He glanced at the tiny screen, his eyes widening as he read the message. Trauma incoming. All hands on deck. Without hesitation, he sprinted down the hallway, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. The pristine floors squeaked under his polished shoes as he burst through the double doors into the operating room. "What VE we got?" he barked, extending his arms as a nurse helped him into a surgical gown. 8-year-old female. Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding. "Car crash," the head nurse, Sarah, replied crisply. Her eyes, visible above her surgical mask, were steady and focused. Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through possible scenarios and procedures. As he pulled on his latex gloves with practiced ease, a fleeting thought of Vanessa crossed his mind. She'd been distant lately, canceling their dinner plans more often than not. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time for that later. "Blood pressure?" he asked, moving to the operating table where the young girl lay, her small body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her. "Dropping fast," another nurse responded. 85/60 and falling. Marcus's jaw set in determination. "We need to stop this internal bleeding now." Scalpel. The next few hours were a blur of focused intensity. Marcus worked tirelessly, his hands steady and sure as he navigated the complex landscape of the girl's injured body. The beeping of monitors and the hiss of equipment provided a constant backdrop to the life-and-death struggle playing out on the operating table. "More suction here," Marcus ordered, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "We've got a bleeder." The team moved like a well-oiled machine, anticipating Marcus's needs before he even voiced them. Time seemed to stretch and compress, minutes feeling like hours and hours like minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus stepped back from the table. He pulled off his surgical mask, revealing a face etched with exhaustion but glowing with triumph. "We've stabilized her," he announced, his voice hoarse but filled with satisfaction. "Good work, everyone. She's going to make it." A collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. Sarah, the head nurse, patted Marcus on the back. "Another life saved, Dr. Steele. You're a miracle worker." Marcus shook his head modestly. "It was a team effort. We all saved her." As he left the operating room, stripping off his surgical gown and gloves, Marcus's thoughts turned to home. He was looking forward to sharing the news of his successful surgery with Vanessa. Maybe it would bridge the growing gap between them, give them something to connect over. The drive home was quick, the streets of their suburban neighborhood quiet in the late evening. As Marcus pulled into the driveway of their modest 2-story home, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A sleek, red sports car that seemed out of place among the family sedans and SUVs that usually lined their street. He frowned slightly but shrugged it off. Probably just a visitor to one of the neighbors. He climbed out of his car, his body aching from the hours of intense concentration and physical strain. All he wanted now was a warm shower, a cold beer, and maybe some quality time with Vanessa. It had been too long since they'd really talked. The moment he opened the front door, he heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Frowning, he made his way towards the sound. Something about the tone, the secretive quality of the whispers, set his nerves on edge. "Vanessa?" he called out, announcing his presence. There was a sudden scrambling sound. Then Vanessa's voice rang out, startled and high-pitched. "Marcus, you're home early." Marcus stepped into the living room, taking in the scene before him. Vanessa was perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture tense, her face flushed. Beside her sat Garrett Sloan, their neighbor and Vanessa's yoga instructor. Something about their body language, the guilty looks that flashed across their faces, set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. "I just performed a life-saving surgery," Marcus said, his pride in his accomplishment battling with his growing suspicion. "I thought we could celebrate." Vanessa's response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "Garrett and I were just discussing yoga techniques." Marcus noticed the guilty look that passed between them, but chose not to comment. His instinct screamed that something was amiss, but he maintained his composure. Years of dealing with high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught him the value of staying calm in the face of unexpected challenges. "I see," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, don't let me interrupt. I'll be in my study if you need me." As he turned to leave, he caught Garrett's smug whisper, clearly not meant for his ears. "He doesn't suspect a thing." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he kept walking, his mind whirling with possibilities he didn't want to consider. What exactly didn't he suspect? And why did Garrett sound so pleased about it? In his study, Marcus sank into his leather chair, his earlier triumph forgotten in the face of this new, personal crisis. He stared unseeing at the medical journals stacked neatly on his desk, his mind replaying the scene he'd just witnessed. The guilty looks, the hushed voices, Vanessa's startled reaction to his arrival. None of it added up to anything good. He heard the front door close a few minutes later, followed by the sound of a car starting up outside. Garrett leaving, he presumed. Then Vanessa's light footsteps approached his study. "Marcus," she called softly, poking her head around the door. "I'm heading to bed. Are you coming up soon?" Marcus looked at her, searching her face for what? A sign of guilt? Remorse? He found nothing but a careful blankness that was almost worse. "I'll be up in a bit," he replied. "Just need to review some patient files." Vanessa nodded and retreated, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and suspicions. The next morning, Marcus awoke to find the bed beside him empty and cold. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. on a Saturday. Vanessa usually slept in on weekends. He found her in the kitchen, already dressed in yoga pants and a fitted top, keys in hand and heading for the door. "Where are you going so early?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. Vanessa startled, nearly dropping her keys. "Oh, Marcus. I didn't realize you were up," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "I have a doctor's appointment." Marcus's suspicions, which had simmered overnight, began to boil. At 7 a.m. on a Saturday, he pressed, unable to keep the skepticism out of his voice. It was the only time they had available, Vanessa replied evasively, not meeting his eyes. She fumbled with her purse, clearly eager to leave. "I've got to run. Don't want to be late." As the door closed behind her, Marcus made a split-second decision. He quickly threw on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed his own keys, and followed her, maintaining a discreet distance in his car. The early morning streets were nearly empty, making it challenging to tail Vanessa without being spotted. Marcus's heart raced, part of him hoping he was wrong, that there was a perfectly innocent explanation for all of this. To his growing dismay, he watched as Vanessa pulled into the parking lot of a nondescript building. The sign out front read, "Fertility Clinic." His heart sank as he recognized Garrett's flashy red sports car already parked there. Moments later, Vanessa and Garrett walked into the clinic together, Garrett's hand resting on the small of Vanessa's back in a gesture that was far too intimate for Marcus's comfort. Marcus sat in his car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The implications were staggering, but he forced himself to think rationally. There could be an explanation. There had to be. He drove to the hospital in a daze, throwing himself into his work to avoid the thoughts swirling in his mind. The day passed in a blur of patients, charts, and procedures. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but chalked it up to fatigue from the previous night's emergency surgery. "You all right, Steele?" Dr. Thompson, the chief of surgery, asked during a brief lull. "You seem a bit off today." Marcus forced a smile. "Just tired from last night's marathon surgery." "I'll be fine." As evening approached, Marcus steeled himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. As soon as he walked through the door of his home, he called out, "Vanessa, we need to talk." She appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face was a mask of forced calm, but Marcus could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "What about?" Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "I saw you at the fertility clinic with Garrett this morning," he said, deciding to cut straight to the chase. "What's going on, Vanessa?" For a moment, shock flashed across Vanessa's face, quickly replaced by defiance. Her pretense of innocence dropped away like a discarded mask. "Fine," she snapped. "I wanted to keep this private, but since you're prying, Garrett and I want to have a baby together. I was hoping you'd be open to me being a surrogate for his child." Marcus was floored. The room seemed to spin around him, Vanessa's words echoing in his ears. "You can't be serious," he managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're my wife." "I'm an independent woman, Marcus," Vanessa snapped, her voice cold and hard. "I can do whatever I want with my body. If you can't accept that, maybe we shouldn't be together." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Marcus felt as if he'd been punched in the gut, all the air driven from his lungs. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Vanessa's chin jutted out defiantly. "Does it matter? Garrett understands me in a way you never have. He supports my choices, my independence." Marcus laughed bitterly. "And I don't? I've always supported your career, your hobbies. I've never tried to hold you back." "It's not about holding me back," Vanessa retorted. "It's about truly seeing me, truly understanding what I need. And what you need is to have another man's baby." Marcus shot back, his calm facade cracking. Vanessa's eyes flashed. "It's not like that. Garrett can't have children of his own. I'm helping a friend." "A friend?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The conversation devolved from there, years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings bubbling to the surface. By the time it was over, Marcus felt drained, as if he'd just come off a 48-hour shift at the hospital. The following days were filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, saving lives and earning accolades at the hospital. It was easier to focus on the pain and suffering of others than to confront his own. "You're on fire lately, Steele," Dr. Thompson commented after Marcus successfully completed a particularly challenging surgery. "Whatever's driving you, keep it up." Marcus just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If only his colleague knew the personal hell that was fueling his professional success. Meanwhile, at home, Vanessa grew more distant and defiant. She made no attempt to hide her frequent meetings with Garrett, coming and going as she pleased without explanation. One evening, Marcus returned home earlier than usual, his shift cut short due to a scheduling mix-up. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Garrett's flashy red sports car parked in front of their house. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he walked in. The scene that greeted him in the living room made his blood boil. Garrett was lounging on the couch, their couch, the one Marcus and Vanessa had picked out together when they first moved in. His arm draped possessively over Vanessa's shoulders. They both looked up as Marcus entered, Garrett's face twisting into a smug sneer. "Face it, Doc," Garrett drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't give Vanessa what she needs. Step aside like a good boy." Something in Marcus snapped. The accumulated stress, betrayal, and anger of the past weeks crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. His voice was dangerously quiet as he said, "Get out of my house. Now." Garrett's smirk faltered, but he didn't move. Marcus turned to Vanessa, his eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen before. "Pack your things," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You're leaving too. You can't kick me out." Vanessa protested, jumping to her feet. Her face was a mix of shock and indignation. "This is my home too." Marcus's voice was steel. "Not anymore. I've already contacted my lawyer. Expect divorce papers soon." The finality in his tone seemed to shock both Vanessa and Garrett into action. As they gathered Vanessa's things, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The life they had built together was crumbling, and there would be no going back. As Vanessa and Garrett were leaving, their arms full of hastily packed bags, Garrett couldn't resist one last jab. "You'll regret this, Steele," he called back, his earlier smugness replaced by barely concealed anger. "I have friends in high places." Marcus simply closed the door, shutting out their voices and the life he once knew. As the lock clicked into place, he leaned against the door, suddenly feeling every bit of his exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, a steely determination was taking root. He walked through the house, now eerily quiet and empty. In the kitchen, he found a bottle of scotch in the back of a cupboard. He rarely drank, but tonight seemed like as good a time as any to start. As he poured himself a glass, his eyes fell on a framed photo on the counter. It was from his and Vanessa's wedding day, both of them beaming at the camera, full of hope for their future together. With a sudden, violent motion, he slammed the frame face down. Sinking into a chair at the kitchen table, Marcus took a long swig of his drink, relishing the burn as it went down. His mind was already formulating a plan. Garrett's parting threat echoed in his ears. Friends in high places, indeed. Well, two could play at that game. Weeks crawled by like wounded animals. Marcus Steele's life had become a monotonous blur of surgeries, rounds, and sleepless nights. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum to his failed marriage. Every corner held a memory he'd rather forget. He threw himself into his work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. His colleagues noticed the change, the intensity that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "Steele, you're on fire," Dr. Thompson commented one day after Marcus had performed a particularly challenging thoracic surgery. "I've never seen anything like it." Marcus just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If they only knew the inferno raging inside him, fueling every incision, every suture. His reputation grew. Whispers in the hospital corridors spoke of his uncanny ability to save patients others had given up on. Best surgeon in the state, they said. Marcus heard, but didn't care. It was all just noise, a distraction from the gnawing emptiness inside. But surgery wasn't enough. He needed more, needed to feel like he was making a difference beyond the sterile walls of the operating room. That's how he found himself at the local community center one rainy Tuesday evening. "You sure about this, Dr. Steele?" asked Maria, the center's coordinator. "These kids, they're not exactly easy to handle." Marcus looked at the group of teenagers slouching in their chairs, eyes full of suspicion and barely concealed hostility. He saw himself in them, the anger, the pain, the feeling of being lost in a world that didn't care. "I'm sure," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's start with basic first aid. You never know when you might need to save a life." As he demonstrated how to apply pressure to a wound, using a mannequin as a prop, he caught the eye of one of the boys. There was a flicker of interest there, a spark of something that looked almost like hope. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. This, he realized, was what healing truly meant. The sessions at the community center became a lifeline, anchoring him to something beyond his pain. He taught first aid, mentored the kids, listened to their stories. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he felt himself starting to heal. But the past wasn't done with him yet. One evening, as he left the hospital after a grueling shift, Marcus noticed a sleek black car idling in the parking lot. As he approached his own vehicle, the black car's engine purred to life. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his pocket, fingers closing around his keys. The black car pulled out, following Marcus as he exited the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, a familiar face came into focus. Garrett Sloan, grinning like a shark that had just scented blood. Instead of fear, Marcus felt a surge of something else. Anticipation. The game, it seemed, was indeed on. He drove calmly, heading not towards home but to a busy shopping center nearby. Garrett followed, maintaining a discreet distance. Marcus pulled into the parking lot, choosing a spot near the entrance of a large bookstore. As he browsed the medical section, pretending to be engrossed in a tome on cardiovascular surgery, he kept one eye on Garrett. The man was lurking near the self-help section, trying and failing to look inconspicuous. Marcus moved closer, ostensibly reaching for a book on the top shelf. As he did, he overheard two nurses from his hospital gossiping in the next aisle. "Did you hear about Dr. Sloan?" one whispered, her voice dripping with scandal. "Apparently, he's been writing fraudulent prescriptions." "No way," her companion gasped. "I always thought there was something off about him." "It's true. My cousin works in pharmacy. Says they've been getting a lot of suspicious scripts lately, all signed by Dr. Sloan." Marcus's ears perked up. He had found Garrett's weakness, the chink in his armor. As he watched Garrett slink out of the bookstore, Marcus allowed himself a small, grim smile. The tables were about to turn. Marcus Steele was a man on a mission. The information he had overheard in the bookstore was just the beginning. He began his investigation with the meticulousness of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Late nights were spent hunched over his computer, following digital breadcrumbs. He called in favors from old colleagues, spoke in hushed tones with pharmacists, and pieced together a disturbing picture of Garrett Sloan's activities. Garrett, it turned out, was no mere yoga instructor. He styled himself as a holistic healer, offering a blend of Eastern mysticism and Western medicine that appealed to a certain type of wealthy, bored suburban housewife. The same type of woman Vanessa had become, Marcus thought bitterly. But Garrett's healing went beyond downward dogs and chakra alignments. He had been prescribing opioids to his yoga clients, feeding their addictions under the guise of pain management and spiritual awakening. Marcus's stomach turned as he uncovered the extent of Garrett's operation. The man was nothing more than a glorified drug dealer, profiting from the misery and desperation of others. As he compiled his evidence, copies of prescriptions, testimonies from pharmacists, even a recorded conversation with one of Garrett's clients, Marcus felt a grim satisfaction. He would bring this charlatan down, not just for personal revenge, but because it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, life had other plans. His phone buzzed one evening, an unknown number flashing on the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. Marcus. The voice on the other end was small, hesitant. Vanessa, what do you want? He was surprised by the coldness in his own voice. Can we talk? Please? I've made a terrible mistake. Part of him wanted to hang up, to cut this last tie to his past. But curiosity, and perhaps a lingering ember of what they once had, made him agree to meet. They chose a neutral ground, a small cafe downtown, far from their old haunts. As Marcus walked in, he spotted Vanessa immediately. She looked different. Smaller somehow, diminished. The confident, vibrant woman he had married was gone, replaced by this pale shadow. I've made a terrible mistake, Marcus, she said as soon as he sat down, not even waiting for pleasantries. Can we work things out? Marcus studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coffee cup. For a moment, he felt a pang of the old affection, the urge to comfort and protect. But then he remembered. The betrayal. The lies. Garrett. His voice was kind but firm when he replied, No, Vanessa. You made your choice. I hope you find happiness, but it won't be with me. He saw the hope die in her eyes, replaced by a resigned acceptance. As he stood to leave, he caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Garrett, watching from the shadows, his face twisted with rage. Marcus walked out of the cafe, feeling lighter somehow. He had closed a chapter of his life, and now it was time to write a new one that would end with justice being served. The next day dawned bright and clear, a mockery of the storm brewing in Marcus's life. He strode into the hospital, mind already racing with plans for the day's surgeries. But as he approached the administrative wing, he noticed the hushed whispers, the sidelong glances from his colleagues. Something was wrong. Dr. Steele? The hospital administrator's secretary approached him, her face a mask of professional concern. Mr. Jameson would like to see you in his office immediately. Marcus's stomach dropped, but he kept his face neutral. Of course, he replied smoothly. I'll head there now. The walk to Jameson's office felt like a march to the gallows. Marcus's mind raced, trying to piece together what could have prompted this summons. He hadn't made any mistakes in surgery, had he? No, he was certain of that. His work had been impeccable, even more so since. The thought trailed off as he reached Jameson's door. He took a deep breath, straightened his white coat, and knocked. Come in, Dr. Steele. Marcus entered to find Jameson seated behind his imposing oak desk, his face grave. Please sit down. As Marcus lowered himself into the chair, Jameson cleared his throat. Dr. Steele, we've received an anonymous complaint about your conduct. We have to suspend you pending an investigation. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Suspension? Investigation? What the hell was going on? But even as the shock coursed through him, a part of his mind was already piecing it together. Anonymous complaint. Garrett's threat echoed in his memory. I have friends in high places. Marcus knew immediately who was behind this. But instead of getting angry, he smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile that made Jameson shift uncomfortably in his seat. I understand, Marcus said, his voice steady. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. May I ask about the nature of the complaint? Jameson looked relieved at Marcus's calm demeanor. The complaint alleges inappropriate behavior with patients and possible substance abuse. I want to be clear, Dr. Steele, these are just allegations at this point. But we have to take them seriously. Marcus nodded, his mind already racing ahead. Garrett had overplayed his hand. These accusations were so far from the truth that they would be easy to disprove. And in doing so, he might just be able to turn the tables on his accuser. Of course, Marcus said, standing up. I assume you'll need my badge and access card for now? Jameson nodded, looking both relieved and slightly puzzled by Marcus's composure. Yes, thank you. And Dr. Steele? For what it's worth, I hope this all turns out to be a misunderstanding. Marcus handed over his credentials, feeling strangely liberated. So do I, Mr. Jameson. So do I. As he left the hospital, his head held high despite the curious and pitying glances from his colleagues, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. This was Garrett's move, and it was a clumsy one. Now it was his turn. The parking lot was nearly empty as Marcus approached his car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt. As he reached for his car door, a voice called out from behind him. How does it feel to lose everything, Doc? Your wife, your job. You should have just played along. Marcus turned slowly to face Garrett, who was leaning against a nearby car, a smug grin plastered across his face. For a moment, Marcus was tempted to wipe that grin off with his fists. But he reined in the impulse. He had a better weapon than violence. You've made a grave mistake, Garrett, Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Garrett's grin faltered for a moment before he forced out a laugh. Big words from a man who just lost everything. Face it, Steele. You're finished. Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. We'll see about that. As Garrett swaggered away, clearly believing he had won, Marcus felt a surge of determination. Garrett had no idea of the evidence Marcus had gathered, of the storm that was about to break over him. Marcus got into his car, his mind already formulating the next steps of his plan. Garrett thought he had won this round, but the game was far from over, and Marcus Steele was playing for keeps. The wheels of justice, Marcus Steele had learned, turned slowly, but they did turn. In the weeks following his suspension, he set his plan in motion with the precision of a master surgeon. His first move was to anonymously tip off the DEA about Garrett's prescription fraud. He used a burner phone, his voice disguised, to call in the tip. You might want to look into Dr. Garrett Sloan, he said. Word on the street is he's been writing scripts for Oxy like they're going out of style. The DEA agent on the other end of the line perked up. They'd been hearing whispers about a doctor running a pill mill in the suburbs, but names had been hard to come by. You got any proof to back that up? The agent asked. Marcus smiled to himself. Check his prescription records, and maybe have a chat with some of his yoga students. You might find they're more interested in Downward Dog than you'd expect. As he hung up, Marcus felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt. Satisfaction, maybe. Or justice. He pushed the feeling aside. This was necessary. Next, he turned his attention to clearing his own name. He'd spent weeks compiling evidence, records of every surgery he'd performed, testimonials from patients and colleagues, even security footage showing him leaving the hospital at times when he was allegedly engaging in inappropriate behavior. He presented this mountain of evidence to the hospital board, along with a bombshell, proof that Garrett had fabricated the complaints against him. The board meeting was tense. Marcus stood before them, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. I've dedicated my life to this hospital and to my patients, he said. I would never do anything to jeopardize that trust. The allegations against me are not just false, they're malicious. He laid out his case methodically, watching as the board members' expressions shifted from skepticism to shock to outrage. By the time he finished, there was no doubt left in the room. The chairman cleared his throat. Dr. Steele, we owe you an apology. Not only will you be reinstated immediately, but we'd like to offer you a promotion. Chief of Surgery. Your dedication and integrity are exactly what this hospital needs. Marcus nodded, accepting their apology with grace. But inside, he was seething. How quickly they had been willing to believe the worst of him. How easily his years of service had been dismissed. As he left the meeting, he overheard two board members whispering, "Did you hear about Sloan? His medical license has been suspended pending a full investigation." Dace involved. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The dominoes were falling, just as he'd planned. But his victory was short-lived. That evening, as he sat in his study, finally allowing himself to relax, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "Marcus." The voice on the other end was panicked, breathless. "Vanessa, what do you want?" he asked, his tone cold. "Marcus, please help." Vanessa's voice cracked with fear. "Garrett's lost it. He's threatening to expose some compromising photos of me if I leave him. I don't know what to do." Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, Marcus felt a twinge of concern. He had loved this woman once. He couldn't simply ignore her cry for help, but he wasn't a fool either. This could be useful. "Stay calm," he said, his mind already formulating a new plan. "I'll handle this." As he hung up, Marcus leaned back in his chair. He had dismantled Garrett's life, piece by piece. Now it was time for the final confrontation. The park was deserted at this hour, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. Marcus stood by the old oak tree, hands in his pockets, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. Garrett came storming across the lawn, his face twisted with rage. Gone was the smug yoga instructor, the smooth-talking charlatan. This was a man on the edge, desperate and dangerous. "You think you've won?" Garrett snarled as he reached Marcus. "I'll destroy you both." Marcus remained calm, his voice steady. "It's over, Garrett. I have evidence of all your crimes. The prescription fraud, the attempted framing, and now blackmail. You have two choices. Turn yourself in and seek help, or I release everything to the authorities and the media." Garrett's eyes widened, darting around like a cornered animal. For a moment, Marcus thought he might actually consider the offer. But then something snapped. With a roar of fury, Garrett lunged at Marcus, his hands clawing for the doctor's throat. But Marcus was ready. Years of martial arts training kicked in. Marcus sidestepped the attack, using Garrett's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he had Garrett pinned to the ground, arm twisted behind his back. "You're pathetic, Garrett," Marcus said, his voice cold. "You've lost everything, and it's all your own doing." Garrett struggled, spitting curses, but Marcus held firm. In the distance, sirens wailed. The cavalry was coming. As the police car pulled up, lights flashing, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. Really over. He gave his statement to the officers, watching as they led Garrett away in handcuffs. The man was still shouting threats, promising revenge, but his words were empty now. He had no power left. One of the officers approached Marcus. "Dr. Steele, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement." Marcus nodded. "Of course. I'll be there first thing in the morning." As he walked away, leaving Garrett and all the chaos behind, Marcus felt lighter. The anger, the bitterness that had been driving him for so long began to ebb away, replaced by a sense of peace. He had faced his demons, had stared into the abyss of revenge, and walked away. He was ready to begin again. Months passed. The seasons changed, leaves falling and snow coming and going. And with each passing day, Marcus felt more like himself again. Or rather, a new version of himself. Stronger, wiser. He stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of eager young faces. Medical students, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to change the world. He remembered being like them once. "Ethics in medicine isn't just about following rules," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the lecture hall. "It's about making the right choices, especially when those choices are difficult." He saw a few students nodding, others scribbling notes furiously. Good. They were listening. "You will face challenges in your careers. Ethical dilemmas that no textbook can prepare you for. When that happens, remember this. Your integrity is your most valuable asset. Guard it carefully. As he wrapped up the lecture, fielding questions from the students, Marcus felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This was why he became a doctor. Not for the accolades or the money, but to make a difference. To help people. After the hall had emptied, Marcus checked his phone. There was a text waiting for him. From Vanessa. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can forgive me someday. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment. So much history there. So much pain. But also, closure. He typed out a simple reply. I wish you well, Vanessa. Goodbye. As he sent the message, Marcus felt the last lingering traces of bitterness melt away. He had forgiven her, he realized. Not for her sake, but for his own. The drive home was peaceful. Marcus found himself reflecting on the tumultuous journey he'd been through. He had lost a wife, yes, but he had gained so much more. Clarity, purpose, a renewed sense of who he was and what he stood for. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw a familiar figure waiting for him. Dr. Sophia Chen, brilliant neurosurgeon and, for the past few months, his girlfriend. She smiled as he got out of the car, her eyes lighting up in a way that still made his heart skip a beat. How was the lecture? She asked, pulling him into a warm embrace. Good, Marcus replied, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. I think they actually listened for once. Sophia laughed, a sound that never failed to lift his spirits. Of course they did. You're Marcus Steele, ethical crusader and surgical wizard. How could they not listen? As they walked into the house together, discussing their days and planning for tomorrow, Marcus felt a profound sense of contentment wash over him. This, he realized, was what he had been searching for all along. Not revenge or validation, but understanding, support, love. The sun was setting over their suburban home, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the end of one chapter, yes, but more importantly, it was the beginning of another, a better one. Marcus Steele had not just survived. He had triumphed. He had faced his trials and emerged stronger, wiser, more compassionate. And as he looked at Sophia, saw the love and respect shining in her eyes, he knew that the best was yet to come.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.